Little upcoming draft talk. I think we're just about a month on the dot from the first round of the upcoming NFL draft. I think we're pretty entrenched on, Caleb Williams go number 1. We'll see how the rest of the top 10 shakes out with the other quarterbacks that are going to go slated, projected to go in the first round. But, around this time of year, everyone's talked about the first round prospects. We all know who's going to go, projected to go in the first round. I'm sure there'll be some surprises on draft day, like there always are. But for the most part, we've kind of talked out the guys who are going to be at the top of the draft. So I want to talk with you more about guys who have, maybe not first round guys, lower end, second to third, fourth round guys who still have a chance to make an impact in the NFL. So we're each going to go over 5. And I want you to start off because, you're really in the weeds with this stuff. So give me a quote unquote draft sleeper for people to get excited about.
So my first one is Malik Washington. He's a wide receiver from Virginia. And he's one that is really, really intriguing. Now, they predominantly played him in the slot. And the first 3 years of his career, he spent at Northwestern. So he was one of those receivers that kind of was hidden in that offense. And we both know Northwestern doesn't have the greatest quarterback play. So he's one of those late bloomer, one of those players that was a little bit hidden in a sense. Mm-hmm. But what you love about him is that he's very strong at the catch point. He's a little bit undersized at about 5'8", right around 190 pounds. But you're watching him at the Shrine Bowl and you're like, man, this is one of the best players, if not the best player here, without question. So I was a big fan of him. If I had to predict, he'll probably go 3rd or 4th round if I had to guess right now. But it would not surprise me if he ends up being a starter somewhere, probably somewhere as somebody's wide receiver 3.
Yeah, I think like someone like Malik Washington is kind of interesting because that reminds me of like the tiers, I guess, of like quarterback play. Because even if you're someone like Malik Washington and you go from Northwestern where, the offensive play is, maybe third most important thing to the team as a whole. And even if you can just get to someone like Brennan Armstrong, who's not like a real NFL prospect, but is quality enough where you can like run an offense and kind of get things popping off. Like that can be somewhere where you can have success in looking at the transfer portal in general and how guys can kind of, change their lives to a degree as far as like the transfer portal goes. Cause we look at a guy, even like, like Tez Walker at UNC, with his jersey going from Kent State to A&T and then the UNC, getting to play with someone like Drake May kind of helps put him on the maps as far as like, being an NFL, like a NFL prospect goes. So I think that those journeys are interesting and we should just see more of them, like as the transfer portal becomes more of a factor in, in college football. What are your thoughts really, I guess, on like how the transfer portal has impacted the draft so far and where you kind of see it taking places in the future?
What's really funny to me, and you can attest to this. Remember like 5 or 6 years ago when we were really getting into the draft, if somebody transferred like 2 or 3 times, it was seen as a huge knock for them. It's like, why is he transferring so many times? Like, what happened? Was it the coach? Was it the player? Like, what are some of the background things that are going on? But now we're seeing guys transfer 2, 3, even 4 times. But now with the transfer portal and NIL, it's added another layer to evaluations just because guys are transferring for favorable variables, I will call it, for lack of better terms, just because of money situations, playing time, and then some other things that could happen in their career. So transferring really isn't seen as a knock anymore. It's more so of just trying to figure out the story behind it and what happened with it. But where we've seen it really affect the NFL draft is that, and I like to use it from a quarterback standpoint. Let's say you're projected to go 6th or 7th round as a quarterback. Let's say, I'll just use a guy, for example, like Keaton Slovis for somebody. If I'm Keaton Slovis, why would I not stay in college and get $1 million plus money in NIL as opposed to being a barely draftable guy or even going undrafted and potentially making a non-guaranteed $600 to $700K? It just makes sense to stay in college if I'm him. So financially it's had a huge effect on the NFL draft, but also the declaration numbers of draft eligible guys have dwindled over the past 5 years or so. So that's where we're seeing a huge improvement, a huge effect in the NFL draft.
I think one of the craziest like transfer draft related things to me this year is what happened at Ohio State. Like where you get Trayvon Henderson back, Denzel Burke, the cornerback back. Then like, dude, this team is loaded. I think, when you hear some of the stories behind the scenes and how much money, I think we've all caught on to the NIL money that guys are getting to go from high school to college. But I think an under talked about thing is how much money these kids are getting to come back to school too. Like, hey, you really might see something that is comparable to like a year one base salary in the NFL as some of these schools like Ohio State and Georgia trying to figure out like how much money these kids are getting to come back and not declare for the draft. Because like you said, dude, a 54 number early entrance like number for the amount of guys that are declaring early for the draft, that's something that 5 years ago would probably cause alarm for a lot of people. Like, why don't these kids want to go to the NFL draft? Well, now, because if you're playing at a big enough school, you might get NFL money to stick around for 1 or 2 more years. So, like you said, I think the transfer portal, NIL, all that stuff is really interesting in the way it's going to, end up developing college football and for the NFL. Because I don't think that you'll ever see a case where, someone's projected to go number 1 and they decide to go back to school for the NIL money, because it's not at that point yet. But if you're, a late first round guy and you're looking at a base salary year one at like $2 million, $3 million, you might be able to get that if you go back to school at some of these spots. Like actually. So I think that's going to be interesting. But back to sleepers. Speaking of a big time school, and I would be remiss if I did this without talking about the Georgia Bulldogs. But Javon Bullard, the safety, I've been such a big fan of his game for such a long time. And I kind of have like a soft spot for these kind of defensive backs where it's not like super great, maybe at any one thing. You're not a home run hitter as an athlete. You're not the biggest guy out there, but you just, for lack of a better term, you just get done out there. You can cover in the slide, cover deep, make tackles in the open field, and maybe he's not going to be a first or a second round guy, but I feel like he's kind of one of those plug and play glue guys in the secondary that if you have some other pieces around him, you can kind of help take you to the next level.
So I was at Pro Day at Georgia a couple of weeks ago, and just watching him move around, like you could tell that he was different. Like everything was just so effortless. But what I love about him is that as a DB, I've always said that half the battle of transitioning to the NFL is confidence. Like I love DBs that just talk junk, like Jair Alexander, Jalen Ramsey, all these dudes, but you have to back it up, of course. But I just think half the battle when you step onto the NFL field is just confidence with a DB. And that's the type of infectious energy that I got from him. And he reminds me so much of Chauncey Gardner-Johnson for some reason.
Ooh, I like that.
I don't know if it's the movement skills, the physicality, the versatility that he plays with, but not saying that he's Chauncey off the field, but on the field, just strictly talk about his playing style. He reminds me so much of him coming out. And I think he's going to have that type of effect on the secondary. And I mean, we saw the impact that he's had throughout his career. But what I love about him is that he's played star, he's played free safety, he's played nickel, he's played strong safety. He's played so many different positions. So now it's like, let's just roll him out there. It doesn't even matter what position he plays in the secondary because nothing's going to be new to him. So I'm with you with Bullard. I like him a lot.
Yeah, and I think he answered some questions about maybe the long speed by running, low 4.4s, low 4.5, high 4.4s. So that should help him out. I just kind of like you said, those guys that just play a little bit of everywhere. Because even when you look at Bullard stuff, the only position where I would say, hey, you probably don't want to put him out there is like outside cornerback. But any other spot, I think he can play for you in a pinch. And some of those guys are so valuable as we see, moving forward. Because I think one of the most interesting things about where the NFL is right now is how cheap some like these nickel corners are. Like you look at what Teron Johnson got from Buffalo, 3 years, $31 million. And find that kind of baffling because the amount of, value as we see, offense become more and more RPO centric or, trying to attack open space, having a dog at your slot position who can come in and fit the run and make tackles in the open field seems like, a pretty valuable piece to me. But for whatever reasons, the finances haven't caught up to that. So, I think even if you can get someone like a Javon Bullard and have them come in and start for a few years, that's turned into like a pretty big source of value as far as like you're building your rosters out. I was reluctant to go watch UConn film because they're UConn and they haven't been very, very good or very fun to watch. But, I think the past couple of years, they've produced some guys. Travis Jones, defensive tackle, he's gotten to a nice start with his career with the Ravens. And now they have another, an offensive line this time, Christian Haynes, who he really stands out amongst the rest of the UConn offensive line, I would say. I think when you look at his tape, he's really explosive in a way that you don't see from, a lot of college guards, and especially a lot of guards who are playing on this level of college football. I think really what gets me excited is like watching the zone blocks and the reach blocks and seeing where he can kind of use his athleticism to get on the move and get people moving and get to the second level. I've become a pretty big fan of his game by watching him play over the past few days. And, as we start working, me and Charles Robinson start putting together this all juice team and coming up with the final selections, I'm going to push pretty hard for him to make it because I think that he's a guy that, you might be able to grab him on day 2. And the next thing you know, you're lining him up for a second deal because he's been that integral to your offensive line. So I'm a pretty big fan of his game.
I'm right there with you. And I will be the conductor of him making the all juice team just because he's so explosive, man. It's been funny seeing. So how I do it is I track all these guys throughout the season just because if I try to play catch up at the end of the year and just watch multiple games on all these dudes, I'll just be way behind. So I remember at the beginning of the season watching that NC State game, and I'm actually watching NC State's defense. And this guard just keeps popping every single time, just absolutely throwing dudes to the ground. So that's one game that always sticks in my mind with Christian Haynes of kind of discovering him at the beginning of the season. But the thing about him is that I wanted to write about him going into the Senior Bowl just because I thought if he had a huge Senior Bowl, he probably could go inside the top 75 just because everybody wanted to see how would he handle some of the interior defensive linemen from, Georgia, Alabama, these SEC, these Big Ten schools. How would he handle that bump up in speed and then that bump up in competition that he didn't see week in and week out? But what you come to find out is that he's super strong. His hands are really good. He has positional flexibility. He's played both guard spots, but some people wanted to see him snap. He snapped a little bit at the Senior Bowl, playing some center, which was a huge question mark for him going into the week. You always want to see if they have that versatility. And I think he's capable of doing that. But what I love the most about him is that he plays so poised. Like a lot of times with interior defenders, you kind of see them falling to the ground or their hands are sloppy. You never get that sense from him. So he's always in control. He's super strong. He has that wide body that you love to see at the position too. So I'm right there with you. I could see him going. It wouldn't surprise me. If he goes in the top 60, that would not surprise me at all. So mid-second round, I think that's probably where he ends up going just because he's checked so many boxes throughout the pre-draft process. And I think he could be a starter from day one without question.